just to start you off, tell me a wee bit about yourself.
So my name's Dominic McSherry. In terms of my professional sort of position, I'm reader in psychology here in the School of Psychology. I've been an academic I got my first post in 1999, so what's that? That's what, 22, 23 years. And I've been primarily working in the area of early adversity for children. So it's children who the experiences of early adversity for children, and then the sort of impact of that on their lives. I'm primarily focusing on children who would experience maltreatment, etc., and have to enter the care system, and then remain in care or be adopted from care. So that's sort of been the main focus of my work. But my work's also broadening out to sort of try and capture multiple aspects of adversity for children in their early years as well. I've taken on recently a role as the editor-in-chief of an international journal called the Journal of Child and Adolescent Trauma. And that has a sort of exposed me to a broader range of areas, and one of them areas then of course being the area of intergenerational trauma.
Well, just leading on from that, can you describe intergenerational trauma?
Well, for me, I mean, intergenerational trauma, I'm sure you've heard this before. Intergenerational trauma sort of emerged, the terminology of intergenerational trauma emerged in relation to the experiences of the children of Holocaust survivors. So that's sort of when this sort of term, became known or was sort of introduced to the sort of lexicon. And what researchers had found was that for the children of Holocaust survivors, they had found that they had a higher probability of experiencing mental health problems, and they put this down to their parents having had those horrendous traumatic experiences, and in some way these experiences were transferred onto their children. So the sort of notion of intergenerational trauma is that somehow trauma is transferred from one generation to the next generation. It's passed on. It's this sort of intergenerational transmission. Now, to be honest with you, I don't think it's a great term, intergenerational trauma, because it sort of has this notion that trauma is passed on from one generation to the other. It's transferred almost like a family heirloom, and the reality is that trauma doesn't operate like that. Trauma is a very personal experience. So only individuals experience trauma, and they cannot pass their trauma experience on to another human being. It's physically impossible. So trauma is always experienced at an individual level. Now, there can be a thing called community trauma, but a community is made up of a group of individuals, and each of those individuals they will have their own personal experience of trauma. And that experience it's important to remember, trauma is all about stress. So when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about stress. You can't have trauma without stress. And people who experience trauma are people who experience adversity in their lives, extreme adversity that creates a stress response that their body then at some stage isn't able to cope with, and then it becomes traumatic stress. And then for some individuals, then it can also continue on beyond the presence of the stressor, and it can become post-traumatic stress disorder. So when we're talking about intergenerational trauma, I think people can misunderstand that in some way it's like the transfer of trauma from one generation to the other, but the reality is it's the impact. Really what it is, it's the impact on the next generation of the trauma that was experienced by their parents. So it's intergenerational trauma is really the legacy of parental trauma. So that's my understanding of it.
With mental health in Northern Ireland, I'm sure you know that mental health is one of the worst in the
It is
UK.
indeed, yeah.
Why do you think there is such a high prevalence of mental health issues?
So I think it's very much linked to, and just following on from what I'm saying, I think it's very much linked to this notion of intergenerational trauma or as I would prefer to call it, intergenerational harm of trauma. So what happens is people are stressed, right? So through the troubles, then we've had generations of people who have been extremely stressed. We've had extremely traumatic instances such as Bloody Sunday, Bloody Friday, the Ballymurphy massacre, the Shankill, things like that. But there's also been wide levels of stress and worry across the broad community. So the way that trauma works is that when you're stressed, that stress can have an impact on you, but it can also have an impact on your behaviour. And one of the biggest impacts can be in relation to parenting. So one of the difficulties is that, and this is what I talk about, the legacy of trauma. For people who are traumatised, then one of the legacy issues of that, the potential harm that can come from that, is that then they become less sensitive in relation to the parenting that they're given. So we know that whenever, and this is more prevalent in relation to very young children. So we know that whenever babies are born, there's this process called attachment theory, and that children need to form an attachment with their caregivers, and that helps them build security through life. It provides them with what we call a secure base. And that security allows them to develop resilience. It allows them to build the sort of the resiliences that are needed in life to face the sort of, the storms of life that come along, so that they bend rather than they break. So being able to form a secure attachment is really essential for children in terms of how they manage throughout life, how they manage in terms of their social and emotional development, and how they manage, the difficulties that they face throughout life. And when a parent is highly stressed and experiencing trauma, it's very difficult for them to provide the type of consistent positive parenting, consistent sensitive parenting that's needed to allow children to form secure attachments. So that's how it can harm. If parents are stressed, it can harm their children. And then that creates insecurity for children. And then that insecurity then has a cascading effect throughout their lives. They go through life with a feeling of fear, anxiety. So there's a bigger risk of developing anxiety disorders. They have more difficulties forming and maintaining relationships. So they'll go into school, and they'll go into school in a fearful way, not trusting people, finding it difficult to form relationships. So the impact on on people who have experienced the stress and the trauma of the troubles, then that the legacy of that then is negative impact in relation to their children. Another thing as well is that it's becoming more prevalent, or we're becoming more conscious of at the moment, is sort of at a genetic level. And I'll not go into all the technical details of this, but we're talking about an area of genetics called epigenetics. So what they've found is that people who experience profound stress, and stress that becomes traumatic stress and toxic stress, that stress can alter to some degree their genes. It's not the genes themselves, but it's how the genes express in relation to the environment. And they've found that those manipulations of the genes can actually be passed on to those people's children through that DNA. So there's a concern there as well in relation to how the type of stress and the trauma that people experience can then impact upon their children. And then if children are carrying through some of those deficits, then they're going to be more prone, more susceptible to mental health issues. So I think in terms of trying to understand where we are in Northern Ireland, we had the troubles, which, if you ask me, really aren't over yet. So there's this sense that we had the troubles and they're over now. I don't think so. You go into some areas of Derry and some parts of Belfast, and people are still struggling with sectarianism and the fear of paramilitary organisations. But in terms of what we experienced as a community across Northern Ireland, and the very, very high levels of stresses the parents experienced, and the potential impact that had then on their children in terms of the parenting that they experienced. And it's nobody's fault. This is what happens when people are highly stressed, that they're not capable of being that sensitive, relaxed parent when there's bombs going off and all of that sort of stuff. So I think it's a combination of the behavioural impacts of the deficits that can be caused in parenting, and then some of the genetic issues. And I think if we look at the early research that was done in relation to intergenerational trauma with the children of Holocaust survivors, there was an assumption that really these Holocaust survivors had experienced horrendous things in the Holocaust, and then that was in some way being passed on to their children, who were thinking about these horrendous events that their parents had, and they were being traumatized by it. That's actually not what happened. Whenever they did these interviews with the children of the Holocaust survivors, what they found was that for an awful lot of them, their parents never talked about the Holocaust, never spoke about it. Actually, that was a problem, that they would never open up. And what they found were the problems that they had was how their parents presented to them, the type of parenting that they got. So they either had extremely stressed parenting, which is what happens. You can become extremely stressed if you've got post-traumatic stress disorder, or they had complete numb parenting. So numbing is another response that people can have when they experience extreme trauma. Either your system will just go into overload, stress overload, and you can't ever turn it off. You're just fearful every moment of the day, or your system shuts itself down. It's like a system shutdown. And people then, they're protected by not having an extreme stress response, but they don't have any response. They just become numb. And a lot of these the children of the Holocaust survivors would have explained that they basically got a sort of a blank or a numb presentation from their parents. And that type of presentation to a child is not going to help them foster secure attachments, because you need this interaction, you need this positivity, you need this to and fro. And if it's only one directional, then it's going to be difficult for them to build security, and then the insecurity will be there. So I think very much the very high levels that we're seeing, I think we could confidently suggest that is going to be related to the high level of trauma that was experienced across Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and the legacy of that then for parenting and for our children. And the other thing as well is to reflect on is that each individual, they're not basically just the sum of their response to what happened to their parents. They have their own experiences. So the kids who were born from the parents who were experiencing the Troubles then went on to experience the Troubles themselves. So there's stress and anxiety in relation to all of that. So these things can all get intertwined. And so I think sometimes it's difficult to sort of tease out, well, what's a cause? What's the impact of the early stuff from your parenting? What's the impact of what you're experiencing now, and how do they interrelate? So it's a complex area, but I think it's very clear that what was experienced across Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and does continue to, in different areas in Northern Ireland, will certainly have impacted the mental health of the population.
Yes, definitely. Do you think enough is being done to combat the mental health crisis in Northern Ireland?
I don't think so. I don't think we have mental health services, and this term is used. It's always been that sort of Cinderella service where there's like lip service paid to the importance of it, but whenever push comes to shove, budgetary decisions are always heavily weighted towards physical health, and there's always this sort of it's like a mental health is an afterthought. And I suppose the reality of that is that whenever mental health is being seen in the broad picture of health, people are going to be focused on what they see in terms of disease and cancer issues and diabetes and all of that sort of stuff. And you can see how that can suck, the vast majority of funding. But it's like policymakers and politicians, they need to be aware that a lot of that physical health stuff is driven by the issues in relation to mental health, because the two are intertwined. So if I take you back to the early studies on intergenerational trauma with the children of Holocaust survivors, they found that those children also had higher probability of developing heart disease, high blood pressure, stroke, etc. So their physical health was being impacted by what they were experiencing in terms of what they were seeing coming through from their parents. So I think that there needs to be a greater recognition that unaddressed mental health issues can also create physical conditions such as heart disease and all of those things. So but yeah, I think there really does need to be a greater recognition of it. Now, I think the recent appointment of the Professor Siobhan O'Neill as the mental health champion for Northern Ireland, and our current health minister, Robin Swan, he's clearly very receptive to mental health. It's great to see, the way that he's responding, and a number of other politicians, and of course, Siobhan is now in place and she's driving forward a mental health strategy. But she's pushing day and daily for the increase in funding that's needed. So she's saying, I think it's that there needs to be a 30% or so increase in mental health funding. So it remains to be seen as to whether that's going to transpire. But we're remaining hopeful. But there certainly is there's unmet need out there, and there's a deficit in terms of the provision of services.
What approach do you think should be taken to address the mental health issues and the effects of trauma?
I think a difficulty is, people can get drawn into conversations about what's the type of trauma and what's its source and all of that stuff. And for me, all of it is to do with stress. You can break through. You need to sometimes see the wood from the trees and try to simplify what the problems are. And the problems are that people are experiencing high levels of stress. And it's the stress then that creates trauma. If you're experiencing stress without supports around you, because the way to prevent the experience of stress becoming traumatic, is to provide people with relational support and economic support and whatever, so that they're able to manage the stresses and they don't become traumatic. So for me, I think what we need is a focus on the stresses that people are experiencing. And one of them, a particular area of focus for me, again, is back to parents. How do you reduce the stresses that people are experiencing? So there are a number of ways that you can do that for parents. You can, and particularly parents who are living in socially and economically deprived areas, because that's where those are the areas where you tend to see the manifestation of trauma, because trauma occurs in contexts where there's multiple stresses. So for me, it would be trying to ensure that parents and young parents across Northern Ireland, but with a particular focus on areas of need, are supported better. So increases in child benefit, increases in tax credits, the provision of high quality social housing with low rents, the provision of free childcare facilities so that people can actually leave their babies and go and get work. I think there are multiple things that can be done. Those things will help reduce stress. You can, at times of crisis such as what we're living through at the moment, government vouchers that are specific to vouchers for heating, vouchers for electricity, vouchers for food, etc. I think are things that would be very successful in helping reduce the level of stress that parents experience. And when you reduce stress, then you increase the capacity for secure and positive relationships. And if children can develop secure and positive relationships, well, then they're less likely they're gonna experience difficulties themselves. So it's almost like breaking the cycle. Another thing that can be done at a community level would be, home You know, better provision of like home support services. There's a thing called like the nurse parent initiative and things like that. You know, where professional support can be built in for all families, and where there are issues, you know, then bespoke support packages can be provided. You know, better Sure Start, better community facilities, better youth clubs for the kids. It's all about just increasing the funding for social care and trying to support communities in the knowledge that, you know, they're likely to be still struggling with the legacy of the troubles and of the trauma and of the stress. And I think if you can get the supports in, that's when you can break the cycles, you know. So that's sort of where I would aim towards.